In the summer of 1950, a small but determined American force known as Task Force Smith soon found themselves in the front lines of the first encounter against North Korea. This clash, set against the backdrop of the Korean War's outbreak, pitted the ill-equipped U.S. troops against the relentless North Korean advance. Undeterred by their outdated weaponry and comprising mainly green recruits, Task Force Smith confronted an imposing challenge with singular determination, halting the North Korean tank column armed with Soviet T-34-85 tanks. The outcome of this historic encounter would not merely test the mettle of Task Force Smith, but also set the stage for the tumultuous chain of events that would shape the course of the Korean War. On the night of June 25, 1950, the Korean Peninsula plunged into chaos as 10 divisions of the North Korean People's Army, or KPA, launched a full-scale invasion of their southern neighbor, the Republic of Korea. Led by a force of roughly 90,000 soldiers, moving in 6 columns, the surprise attack caught the Republic of Korea armed forces off guard, leaving them ill-prepared for the onslaught. The 38,000 South Korean soldiers, plagued by disorganization and lack of equipment, offered little resistance. The numerically superior North Korean forces swiftly overwhelmed isolated pockets of South Korean soldiers along the front lines before advancing relentlessly southward. Most South Korean units were forced to retreat, and by June 28th, the North Koreans had seized control of Seoul, the capital of South Korea, compelling the government and its battered army to retreat further south. In a bid to prevent South Korea's complete collapse, the United Nations Security Council took action, voting to send military forces to aid the beleaguered nation. The U.S. 7th Fleet, under the command of Task Force 77, and led by the fleet carrier USS Valley Forge, set sail, while the British Far East Fleet dispatched several ships, including HMS Triumph, to provide crucial air and naval support. Despite naval blockades and aerial attempts to slow the North Korean advance, it soon became clear that more was needed to halt the unstoppable march of the KPA. Following the conclusion of World War II, President Harry Truman and Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson took significant steps to reduce military spending. These measures had a notable impact on American forces stationed in Asia, particularly those engaged in occupation duties. As a result, the troops found themselves ill-prepared and lacking essential resources for extensive military exercises. Instead of functioning as a robust defensive force against potential communist threats, they were more akin to constabulary units. Thus, on June 25, 1950, North Korea launched a surprise invasion of South Korea with a well-equipped and superior force, catching its southern neighbor and the United States completely unprepared. Still, President Truman, with his strategic mindset, saw the Korean conflict as an opportunity to halt unchecked communist expansion and demonstrate America's unwavering commitment to protecting nations facing threats from stronger communist neighbors. His resolve led to the deployment of U.S. forces to South Korea under the banner of a United Nations resolution. Notably, the Soviet Union's absence from the UN Security Council vote played a pivotal role in facilitating this move, setting the stage for American involvement in what would later be known as the Korean War. For his part, General Douglas MacArthur, a seasoned military strategist, strongly recommended sending air, ground, and naval forces to assist the beleaguered Republic of Korea, the ROK Army, which was struggling to repel the North Korean advance. Amid this tumultuous backdrop, a unit known as Task Force Smith, part of the 24th Infantry Division, was selected for deployment to South Korea. Facing a dire situation, Major General William F. Dean, the division's commander, made the tough decision to deploy the 1st Battalion from the 24th Infantry Division. He chose this unit because its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bradford Smith, possessed the most combat experience, having fought in the Battle of Guadalcanal during World War II. In March of 1950, Smith's battalion achieved the highest score among all units stationed in Japan during its technical test. This accomplishment was noteworthy, yet they were not anticipating that their readiness would soon be put to the test. Task Force Smith was chosen primarily because it was the closest element of the 24th Infantry Division to Korea and possessed a strong sense of unity among its ranks. And, at least on paper, Task Force Smith was ready. Although limited in training resources due to budget constraints during their stationing in Japan, Task Force Smith received orders to deploy to South Korea on June 30th, 1950. These orders were unexpected, directing them to fly across the Sea of Japan to assist the South Korean forces, who had abandoned Seoul and were in full retreat. The C-54 Skymaster transport aircraft would airlift the battalion from the division's garrison in Japan to Korea. Their mission, blocking the advance of the North Korean forces and holding the line, while the rest of the division could be transported by sea to South Korea. Brigadier General John H. Church presented their mission as providing moral support to the Koreans, with a casual remark to Smith, quote, "All we need is some men up there who won't run when they see tanks." Little did they know that their actions were intended to serve a larger purpose. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of American forces in the Far East, had grander designs. He viewed this task force as an opportunity for an arrogant display of strength, although this might not have been apparent to them at that moment. The stage was set for the Battle of Osan. The battle commenced on July 5th, when Task Force Smith encountered the first North Korean tanks. At around 7:30 a.m., a column of 33 tanks began their southward advance on the highway, but they were no ordinary armored vehicles. They were Soviet-made T-34s, the very same machines that played a pivotal role in defeating Nazi Germany during World War II. As they steadily closed in, the lead enemy tanks were positioned about 4,000 yards away when the American howitzers sprang into action. Despite limited resources, Task Force Smith engaged the enemy with small arms, bazookas, and recoilless rifles. However, their weaponry was mostly ineffective against the North Korean armor, which continued to advance. The artillery shells fired by the Americans largely bounced off the angular steel armor of the T-34s. Second Lieutenant Ali Connor bravely fired 22 rockets from a bazooka at a T-34 a mere 15 yards away and saw them bounce off harmlessly. The battle escalated, and Task Force Smith's defenses were compromised. The lack of effective anti-armor weapons and poor communication with their artillery put Task Force Smith at a disadvantage. By 10 a.m., the North Korean tank column had traversed the highway that sliced through Smith's defensive position and disappeared to the south. The artillerymen somehow managed to destroy 2 tanks and disable 2 more, but in doing so, the forward howitzer's crew had depleted all 6 of the task force's precious anti-tank rounds, their sole means of piercing the T-34's armor. Task Force Smith had faced the tanks head-on and not retreated, but they also had learned the bitter truth that they were powerless against such dreadful armored adversaries. The enemy had disrupted communications by severing the wire connecting the infantry and artillery units, overran the artillery positions, and inflicted an unknown number of casualties, leaving the task force severely battered. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the ominous sight of yet another enemy column materialized on the horizon, an imposing force spanning 6 miles of tanks and a sea of infantry troops that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distant landscape. Task Force Smith swiftly initiated their defensive maneuvers, unleashing a barrage of firepower upon the approaching North Korean forces. However, the grim reality set in as time ticked away. In a mere half hour, the situation deteriorated drastically. The North Korean tanks relentlessly pounded Task Force Smith's positions with a never-ending onslaught of machine guns and cannon fire, while the nimble enemy infantry executed a flanking maneuver, strategically seizing high ground positions on both flanks of the embattled defensive line. By mid-afternoon, the circumstances had become inescapable. The communication lines with their artillery had been severed, rendering any hope of calling for reinforcements futile. Task Force Smith, encircled and beleaguered, faced the grim inevitability of complete annihilation. The once tangible semblance of arrogance that General MacArthur had hoped to maintain, and the diffused steadfast soldiers might have clung to, evaporated in the face of this overwhelming threat. The harrowing reality pushed many to bug out, a somewhat euphemistic term for the desperate act of desertion. Outnumbered and outgunned, Smith had no alternative but to issue the order for a strategic retreat, a decision that meant leaving behind fallen comrades, wounded soldiers, and their invaluable howitzers. By day's end, the toll of the battle was nothing short of devastating. The withdrawal itself was a tumultuous and chaotic ordeal, with some men forsaking their heavy weapons and wounded comrades in their frantic escape. The Battle of Osan marked the inception of U.S. ground involvement in the conflict. This initial clash underscored the vulnerabilities of American forces at the outset of the war. Outdated equipment proved inadequate to contend with North Korean armor, and the relatively inexperienced and poorly trained U.S. units found themselves outmatched by their better prepared North Korean counterparts. Additionally, the substantial numerical advantage of North Korean troops played a pivotal role in determining the battle's outcome. Undisciplined U.S. troops prematurely abandoned their positions, leaving behind equipment and wounded comrades for North Korean forces to seize. General Smith, in hindsight, admitted that he had lingered too long in his position, permitting North Korean troops to encircle the American force, resulting in substantial casualties as they retreated. These vulnerabilities persisted in subsequent engagements with other U.S. units over the following month. The North Korean advance continued for weeks on end, setting a bleak tone for the early stages of the conflict. Despite the significant defeat, Task Force Smith did manage to fulfill its mission by delaying the advance of North Korean forces for several hours. During the battle, the 34th Infantry Regiment of the 24th Infantry Division was stationed in Pyeongtaek, located 15 miles to the south, only to suffer a similar defeat at the Battle of Pyeongtaek. Over the ensuing month, the 24th Infantry Division engaged in numerous battles aimed at slowing the advance of North Korean forces, with outcomes mirroring their earlier struggles. Within a week, the division had been forced back, where it was once again defeated at the Battle of Daejeon. The North Koreans consistently overwhelmed U.S. forces, ultimately pushing the 8th Army all the way back to Pusan. It was here that the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter would unfold, culminating in the eventual defeat of the North Korean army. In the years that followed the Korean War, the U.S. Army used Task Force Smith's training areas in Japan as a memorial. A monument dedicated to Task Force Smith was also erected on the Osan battlefield. An annual commemoration of the Battle of Osan is still held by the 8th Army, which maintains its headquarters in South Korea. On July 16, 2010, exactly 60 years after the Battle of Osan, leaders from the 8th Army, in collaboration with Osan's government officials, organized another ceremony. They paid tribute to Task Force Smith and described the engagement as, quote, the opening shots of a war of ideas that exists even today.